viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting from home in Ripponden in West Yorkshire. As you may know, if you have listened to episode number 136 of my podcast, there was something of a gap between it and episode number 135. And to help catch up with everything in between, which was a lot, I invited some friends of the podcast, old and new, to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them and hopefully to you viewers. 9 conversations were recorded, elements of which formed part of episode number 136, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the 7th of the 9 and is a conversation between Andrew Taylor and Paul Smith about statutory consultees. Andrew is Group Planning Director at Vistry and Paul is Managing Director at the Strategic Land Group. Their conversation takes in the role and influence of statutory consultees within the planning system and the proposed reform of that role and influence. Enjoy.
Statutory consultees seem to be taking up quite a lot of media time at the moment, a lot of radio time this week, as Matthew Pennicook issued a written ministerial statement on the 10th of March, talking about changes that he's proposing to the statutory consultees, some specifically and some more general changes, and talking about a consultation coming up later on in the spring. But Paul, what are statutory consultees and what do they do?
Yeah, great question to start us off with, isn't it? So what are stat consultees? They are organisations outside of the local planning authority that they are by law required to consult on particular planning applications. And the idea, I suppose, is that they can bring skills, knowledge or expertise that the planning authority doesn't have in order to make those applications better and comply with the relevant bits of policy and legislation. I think the reason that they, and that's a very noble objective and not something that I suppose anybody would really have issue with in principle. As so often with the planning system, the issue starts to arise when you look at the detail of how that operates. And, if you look at the list of consultees, for instance, it's a real mixed bag of organisations that some of them it's perhaps not entirely clear why they might be there.
Well, presumably it's a historical quirk to some extent, isn't it? And the list has grown, I think there's 27 now, covering a whole range of different things. Most of the ones that people know about, the Environment Agency, Natural England, Highways England, they're the key ones that most people know about, but the list is quite long and very detailed. So we've got the Coal Authority and the Gardens Trust has obviously hit the headlines a bit, and Theatres Trust, because they're some of the ones that are named in the organisation. But then toll road concessionaires are also a statutory consultee, and that goes to your point about what is that purpose, and are they the really the relevant things for planning authorities to actually have to consult on new applications?
Yeah, and I think the planning system is great for every time there's a reform, we give more responsibilities to the planning system and never sort of stop and think about what could be taken away. And, the Coal Authority, which you mentioned, presumably they're on the list because way back in the day when they were added, we needed to make sure that development wasn't prejudicing our ability to mine coal. But that's perhaps less important now. And they're arguably consulted about different things now, about the risks of subsidence and, unidentified shallow mine workings, which, are arguably taken into account through other regulatory processes around remediation strategies and ground investigations and things like that in a modern context.
And I suppose that, before we get into what the written ministerial statement said, I suppose that's quite one of the important points. Their purpose is to advise the local authority. And going back to my time in local authority, you would place great weight on the comments from a statutory consultee. Well, obviously, because they're a statutory consultee and they're even more important than some of the other local organisations that you consult, arguably. And a lot of that weight has therefore I suppose meant councils have waited for comments to come in. They've placed great weight on it in terms of the decision-making process. And I suppose arguably one of the concerns from government and the development industry has been, well, there's too much weight and there's too much delay or too much focus placed on their views, as opposed to the weighing up of that planning balance.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, isn't it? That in some instances, stat consultees have almost an effective veto over planning applications for what might seem to be, in the overall planning balance, relatively minor issues. And I think we can draw a distinction here too between comments that go to some, really important safety or technical input, like the health and safety executive and, making sure we're not building homes too close to blast zones and things like that. It's probably quite important that there's some engagement with them. But at the other extreme, often the responses are really telling the local authority planners whether the application complies with planning policy. And it's not hugely clear to me, the extent to which that sort of a process is adding value when the organisation making that judgment only has to look at that very narrow focus. They don't have to look at the application in the round and the benefits in the round. They've got one singular objective, and it's binary for them. You either comply with that policy or you don't. And that's where some of these proposals come from, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, indeed. So you've got that putting, I suppose it puts greater onus on the local authority in whichever guise they're going to be after reorganisation, but it puts greater weight on those local authorities to be able to stand up and make decisions themselves in terms of weighing up those different balance and the different issues, rather than relying on the statutory consultee. So Matthew Pennycook's written ministerial statement sort of talks, I think he picks up 5 things, but the first is about setting the context, the economic growth of the country, which is broader than just housing growth, but the economic growth of the country is being really important. The government setting that out, and sort of, it's reminding statutory consultees that that's part of the process and that they have a responsibility there as well. Which, I don't know. I think that goes to your point about them being very narrow and very focused. I'm only looking at theatre being one of them, or only looking at a playing field, from Sport England's perspective, as opposed to, or how does it fit in with that broader context?
Yeah, and I think it's a really important starting point, isn't it? It's that question we started with. What are stat consultees for? And I think before you can reach any conclusions as to who they should be, what they should be commenting on, the weight that should be afforded to their decisions, why are we speaking to them in the first place? And if you've got that really clear objective, I think some of the downstream questions become much easier to address, rather than just thinking, oh, well, that's a good thing. We need to protect theatres.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it is, but is this the right route to do it?
Exactly. And I think the next 2 bits of the written ministerial statement sort of talk about the scope of statutory consultees in the planning system and sort of when they should be engaged. And I think for me, most of the time statutory consultees seem to be involved is in the development management process. It's a formal consultation once a planning application has been submitted. It's getting that advice on the detail of the layout quite often, or the junction or the flood zone or whatever it is. And actually there's a sort of a question about, well, actually should we, one, restrict the type of applications that are sent to the statutory consultees, restricts the type of consultation. But then also, should we upstream their focus? Should we push their focus to the local plan process, or the statutory plan, the strategic plan process, and then the local plan process, rather than at the development management stage? Because there's arguably that will have greater focus in terms of that development of policy, development of allocations and things like that than at the DM stage.
Yeah, there's definite merit in that, isn't there? And it speaks to the points I made earlier about sometimes these consultees are just saying whether policy is being complied with. And, Sport England, that's often what they're doing. Active Travel England is another one that arguably falls into that category. And where they can be adding most value is producing really clear guidance as to what they would view policy compliance to be, to provide the relevant support to local authorities in understanding what that guidance is, and then leaving councils to get on and deal with the guidance themselves, rather than having to check back in with them all the time. And by all means have a hotline that they can ring to say, oh, we've got this particular application, we're not quite sure where it falls. But that doesn't need to be a statutory thing that gives that consultee a veto on development. And the further up the chain you can push that, the easier it is for developers to actually take it on board as well, because what's needed.
I think we've seen to some extent that happening with Natural England in terms of standing advice and things like that. Trying to say you don't need to consult us. Here's our standing advice. It has the same weight as our specific letter back to you on this topic. But yeah, why do we need, arguably, he postulates, rather than forming a clear view, why do we need National Highways being involved in a development management application on an allocated site? They should have had that principal input at the local plan stage or even the strategic plan stage. And then the detail should be down to the local highway authority and the determining authority to make that decision, rather than you having to go back through that loop again. It seems to be a much more logical approach, and then free up time for the statutory consultees to engage in that local plan process, rather than the detailed development management which should be dealt with at that local level.
Yeah, I think so. And there's some parallels or some echoes there with modernising planning committees, I think is the euphemism the government's chosen for that, in that it's about upstreaming the involvement of local councillors to an extent, make sure they're involved in the plan process and setting the policies, but then let the expert local authority planners take more responsibility for applying them, because that enables them to consider things in the round a little bit better.
Yeah. So I think the fourth thing that Matthew Pennycook set out in his written ministerial statement was in relation to performance. So speed of coming back, I suppose, and there's comments in relation to issuing of directions. So I think mostly I've had that from National Highways issuing directions when they haven't been able to respond within the time period, both from a local government perspective and as a developer perspective. But that performance is quite an interesting one, because most statutory consultees, the planning process is a small element of their work. It's not the core area. So I don't know whether, is that because they don't focus on it as much? It's not part of their core aim. So the Environment Agency, as an example, there's a broader focus on, regulating on management of streams and open spaces and water bodies, things, as opposed to responding on the planning side. Is that part of the problem in terms of performance?
I think it probably is. And if Sam were with us, he'd say it definitely is, because I know that's one of his particular hobby horses, isn't it? That it's only a small fraction of what these organisations do, and therefore how much care, attention, management time does it get? It's sort of, we've all got, in all of our jobs, we've got slightly peripheral things that we have to do and we don't like doing. Does it sort of fall into that category? How you resolve that, though, I think is difficult, because it's okay to say, let's manage performance. And that sounds a really sensible way of improving it. But we've got to, I'm always really cautious about unintended consequences when we do things like that. So, you'll remember, Andrew, when authorities started being benchmarked against applications determined in 13 weeks. And the first thing that happened was loads of applications got refused after 12 weeks and 6 days. So then the government said, well, actually 13 weeks or the agreed extended time period to avoid that happening. And the use of extensions of time exploded. And the outcome of all of that benchmarking and monitoring isn't actually that applications get determined more quickly. It's that there's an extra paperwork process for planners to deal with in terms of agreeing time extensions. And what will happen with monitoring stat consultees? Will you get more holding objections to trigger an extension? Will you get, if you can't do a holding objection, I'm sure you could have some sort of generic objection that says there's not enough information here. and make it look like it's the applicant.
Which I think is one of those points, isn't it? Yes, within the statement saying that you can still say there's not enough information, which is normally what National Highways say. Oh, I need an additional study done on this, or there's not quite enough information. And I suppose that's why I'm more interested in freeing up capacity. If you free up capacity within the system by, focusing on the local plans, on, increasing the bar of when applications are sent, so it's no longer 10 houses up, it's a higher, whatever that threshold might be, and numbers aren't everything, and I get that point. But moving that threshold up to say, well, actually, you could take out, you don't consult below 50 or the 100. Link it to the committees. What applications go to committee? Well, obviously that means they're strategic and really focus. And the strategic application should mean it probably is a broader than local decision. So it might bring in the statutory consultees. I think that's an interesting one in terms of where you might set that, because then that frees up capacity within the StatCons to focus on the applications that they are consulted on.
And presumably, if you did that, you'd almost need. Do you think you need slightly different thresholds for different consultees, dependent on what the issue is they're dealing with?
Yeah, I can see that. Because of the, arguably, if you're consulting on flooding, whether it's one house or 100 houses, it's probably has that impact, isn't it? A junction on the highway, it probably is more of a. But that gets very messy, doesn't it? It gets very messy in terms of how you create a simplified system in terms of consultees.
Yeah, and that messiness is one of the challenges, isn't it? Because I think, we've talked about some consultees that maybe shouldn't have quite as big a role as they do, but there are other areas where you have multiple consultees responding on the same issue. Drainage is a good example where you can get the Environment Agency, utilities companies, lead local flood authority, the council's drainage engineer, all getting involved. Highways, you can have the local highway authority, Active Travel England, and Highways England all getting involved on the same scheme. And it's not unusual that you get contradictory responses from those organisations. And that for certainly with our schemes, that's one of the areas that can take us lots of time, almost brokering a peace between the Environment Agency and United Utilities.
Yeah. I mean, a slight tangential point, but it'd be interesting to see when we have the devolution and reorganisation. You mentioned the Highway Authority, lead local flood. Well, they're the same. They're not the same technically the authority, but where do they sit in the reorganised structure of local government? And actually, can you make it so that you are consulting one body, whatever that is? The combined authority. You are consulting whoever that is, and they have to respond. Thinking back to our local plan days, I remember again, not all statutory consultees, but the same point. You consulted the county council, and education responded, and the flooding team responded, and the highways team responded, and the highways team wanted the development in a completely different place, the education team. And it was sort of, actually, county council, you need to think about this in a broader perspective and try and come with that view. And it's almost a little bit the same with that statutory consultee bit in terms of, well, how do you, or is it that it's then just down to that, not just, it is down to the decision maker to make that decision and weigh that up. And it goes back to therefore the importance of those comments. And actually, they are just consultees in the process, and it's the decision maker that weighs up that planning balance.
Yeah, I think that's really important, isn't it, when you get these cross-cutting comments? Because we talked about ones where they've got similar disciplines, but they don't need to. There's often a tension between the Highways Authority and whoever's responsible for commenting on the design. That plenty of local authorities are still essentially using the old 1960s DB32 type guidance for prescribed road widths and junction radii. And yet, if you look at the National Model Design Code and Manual for Streets and all the more recent guidance, it steers you away from that a little bit. And I'm sure we're both used to seeing images on social media of new build developments and criticism being leveled at the developer for what it looks like. And often that's the result of the compromise position reached between different competing stat consultees and the power imbalance between them. That the urban design officers probably got less weight than the Highways Authority in those debates.
And I think actually that's picked up slightly in reframing that the British Ministerial Statement talks about in terms of saying, well, it should be focused on safety. It should be focused on the, quite narrowing it down to certain. Obviously, the consultation will set that out in more detail, and we'll have our say. But actually, that might make those points even more challenging if highways are purely focusing on safety. And certainly, all my councillors, used to say, well, actually, this is a safety aspect. We can't go against what that is. But if that's contradicting good design, using that generic term, which might come from, Active Travel England, or it might come from Sport England, or it might come from, National Design Guide that you mentioned, those tensions. But if it goes to safety, that's when those sort of the heaps of weight is added onto it, isn't it? As opposed to that broader decision making.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because what does safety mean? And again, lots of conversation recently about smaller window sizes to reduce the risk of falls from
Stop you falling out.
Yeah, that is a safety thing, but is it really a safety thing? It can be quite easy to rebadge particular issues under the safety umbrella if that's what you need to do to sort of not keep your control over it, but maintain your influence over those issues. It's quite easy to betray things in that manner, I think.
We must talk about the fifth thing that Matthew Pennicott put in his statement, which was about funding the statutory consultees, and sort of the proposal we will wait and see. But it seems to be that a new model to support this sustainable funding, whatever this means for statutory consultees, but to enable them to have sufficient capacity. We will set out further details in the coming weeks, it says, which is, very exciting. I have to wait and see. But at the moment, we're seeing some statutory consultees, charge for a bit of services. There is that ability for that. Sometimes they're included in planning performance agreements that we sort of bring together. But ensuring incentivizing efficient and constructive engagement in applications. So it sounds as though there may well be a charge levied on planning applications. It may well be a bit of a planning performance agreement type thing that you enter into with statutory consultees to try and make sure that the process is working for people, which that agreement sounds positive, whether the additional fees necessarily are, but I'd be interested to see how that might work.
Yeah, I'm extremely loath to say the devil is in the detail, but it's a great idea in theory, isn't it? But it'll be interesting to see how that can be executed in practice, because application fees are already going up and up and up and up, and there are the SME developers in particular. That becomes an increasing barrier to entry when you've got to pay ever increasing amounts of money just to find out if you were allowed to build those homes in the first place. The fact that pre-application charges are going up again is another example where it becomes more and more expensive just to test the principle of development, and starting to add additional charges over and above that for advice from statutory consultees, some of whom are commercial organisations who will stand to profit from the new occupiers of those houses if the development is built. I'm inherently cautious and apprehensive about that sort of mindset, but we'll see.
And I think it's links to the planning infrastructure bill. Well, it's not linked. In my mind, I can link it to the decision that government seems to be going down in terms of funding ring-fencing development management, but requiring the councils to pay for the local plan, setting that policy, setting that structure in place. Well, to my mind, there's a little bit of a similarity or read across, but for statutory consultees, if they are statutory, it's because the state thinks that they are important to be involved in that process, and they have something of the state needs to say these things through these bodies, and therefore, arguably, just the same with the local plan process, that should fall on the state to deal with in terms of funding for those and setting up that. So, yeah, I'm also cautious in terms of how that goes, but there's a principal point, which would be interesting to see whether other people think about that in comments after these recordings are published. But actually, going back to that point about if we free up capacity by slimming down the number of consultations that they receive, focusing on the core issues, upstreaming it to the local plan stage, that in itself will free up the capacity to be able to deal with the applications, which in a timely way, which is probably the point of the fee, to actually provide additional capacity. So you can do it in different ways by actually simplifying it and really focusing on the core things that needs to be involved with.
Yeah, that will definitely make a difference, won't it? But I suppose the counter argument is if you think your input into an application is so important that it should be required by law, perhaps you should be funding that yourself. Rather than looking, we've all got lots of statutory obligations that we need to fulfill. And we don't always go asking third parties to fund it for us.
No, indeed. Well, as you say, the devil will be in the detail. The consultation, it promised in the next few weeks. So we wait and see what that says.
Hello, viewers. Sam again. My thanks to Andrew and Paul for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other 8, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about devolution, strategic planning and local government reorganisation, CPO, land value capture and benchmark land value, infrastructure planning, modernising planning committees, development and nature recovery, grey belt, design and placemaking, and the flood risk sequential test. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners, and so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. What have we learnt? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.